what's up guys, and welcome to 31 Typhoon, the Primalist range area of effect soul. This soul has some very impressive upfront burst as well as decent sustain damage, making it a great choice for any situation where you need to take down groups of enemies from a distance. In this guide I'll show you where to put your soul points, which masteries to select, as well as how to play Typhoon. So let's go ahead and take a look. Looking at the soul tree breakdown, you'll see we put the full 31 points into Typhoon. That is specifically because, like usual, at the bottom of the tree here we have a couple of key abilities that are really important to Typhoon's playstyle, such as Tsunami, as you see here, and also Rippling Ether. For the secondary and tertiary souls, we go 4 in Vulcanist to pick up 16% attack power and weapon damage with Furious Power, and 4 in Dervish to pick up another 16% attack power and weapon damage with Might of the Earth. Together that's a 32% attack power and weapon damage increase, which scales very well with Primalist. For the Masteries level 61, we take Exhilaration. The main thing this does for you here is it's going to increase your range by 5 meters, so it makes your abilities 35 meters instead of 30 meters. And it'll also heal you in combat 25% of your endurance every 3 seconds. For level 62, we take Forest Matron. This is going to increase your healing done and absorption granted by 5%, which doesn't really do much for us. But what it does do for us is reduce the interval of Torrential Rain by 1 second. Torrential Rain is going to be your damage over time ability, which is this guy right here. As it stands, before you use this mastery, it ticks once every 3 seconds. When you have the mastery, it ticks once every 2 seconds, which is a pretty big, substantial damage increase for it. Moving up to level 63, we take Feline Reflexes. This just allows you to have a 12% run speed buff after a little bit in combat. Level 64, we take Elemental Affinity. This ends up being a 6% damage increase for you. And at level 65, of course, we take Ancestral Force because it is a very strong AoE damage cooldown, which is the focus of this build. So that's it for the souls and masteries, guys. Let's go ahead and talk about the macros briefly here. So pulling up the macros, starting at the top, we have the area of effect spam macro. It literally only has 2 abilities in it. It has low stability, which is this guy here, simply just a normal AoE cooldown ability. And then we have Wind Shear, which is this guy right here, which is one of your spammable AoE abilities. Moving on down, we have the Turmoil Spender. One of the main mechanics of this spec is that you'll stack up stacks of Turmoil, up to 25 stacks. And you'll use those stacks of Turmoil to use these hard-hitting abilities such as Tsunami, Hurricane, Cloudburst, etc. We'll talk about those in a minute. So this Spender macro allows you to use those abilities from one macro. Move on down, we have the PA macro. This is going to have your Primal Avatar buff, which if you're familiar with Primalist, you know that every single soul that the Primalist has a Primal Avatar style cooldown. This guy right here. It's also going to have Storm Rage, which is another one of your cooldowns as well. And then after that, we're going to have a couple different other abilities here to use in your opener and every on the 30-second mark and the 60-second mark. But again, we'll talk more about this here in a little bit. And then moving on down, of course, we have the single target macro, which is simply just going to be a low stability, and then Raging Waters, which is your single target spam. The single target damage in this build is not very great. It's pretty lackluster actually, but we'll go over it briefly in the video just to let you guys know how to do it. Moving over to the right, these guys right here, they're not specifically used for actual macros. Like I don't actually cast these from here. They're just simply there so I can mark how many stacks of the Turmoil that they use. For instance, Tsunami uses 10 stacks, the Hurricane uses 5, Cloudburst uses 5, and Hail Volley uses 5. You can completely forget these macros if you want to and not put them down. I just simply have them there to remind me which ones use how many stacks. So that's it for the macros, guys. Pretty straightforward. There's only really 4 there, 3 main ones that you're going to be using. So let's go ahead and move on to the action bar. So starting at the top left here, we have Font of Frenzy. This one is extremely important because for however many enemies you hit, it gives you a stack of this buff that increases your damage by 3%. So if you hit 8 enemies, it's going to increase your damage by 24%. So it's extremely huge and extremely important to make sure that you have that buff on before you start the fight. Moving over to the right, these aren't buffs right here. These are going to be cooldowns. So your Storm Rage is going to increase the damage of your next 5 damaging abilities by 30%, and the critical hit chance by 40%, and it lasts 30 seconds. This one right here is really huge. You want to definitely be using this one with your Turmoil Spenders, and also it works on Ancestral Force, but we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. Moving on to the right, we have Rippling Ether. This one by itself is just a really strong AoE cooldown, but as you see in the latter part of the tooltip there, it applies Icy Shards to each enemy hit. One of the main mechanics of this build, other than the Turmoil, is going to be your Icy Shards and making sure that you're keeping those up. This right here is going to account for a very large chunk of your damage, so you're going to be alternating between Icy Shards and Rippling Ether to make sure that you're keeping that buff up. And again, we'll talk about that later. Moving on down, we have the single target macro here on Z. We have the PA buff burst macro style thing here on Q. We have Torrential Rain, which is your AoE damage over time ability on E. And just a quick note, this also is going to increase the damage of your low stability by 20%. which is this guy right here. Moving over to the R key, we have Ancestral Force. You're never really going to cast that from there. I mostly just have that there just in case you need to use this as a healing cooldown. You can use it like that because it's also in your Q macro here. Moving over to the right here, these abilities are just here so that I can show you what they do. The kind of one of the weird interactions that you have in this build is that Torrential Rain increases the low stability damage by 20%, which is this guy. Low stability increases your Wind Shear damage by 20%, which is this guy. And Wind Shear increases your Divergence damage by 20%, which is this guy. So you can see the natural order of things is to kind of go, make sure you have Torrential Rain up and then use low stability, Wind Shear, Divergence to make sure that you're getting those buffs all the way across. We'll talk more about that again later. Moving on down to the main bar, on the 1 key we have the AoE spam macro, which has your low stability and also your Wind Shear in it. On 2 we have Divergence, which is another spam AoE ability. On 3 we have the Spender macro, which is going to have your Hurricane, your Cloudburst, and your Hail Volley in it, and we'll talk more about why we have those 3 and not Tsunami in it in a little bit. On 4 we have Icy Shard. You're going to be using this quite a bit in between using your Rippling Ether to make sure you keep Icy Shards up. And of course over here to the right we just have these guys so we can show you the tooltips and I can remind myself how many stacks of turmoil they consume. Middle click here, or the 0 key if you haven't mapped it as a middle click, is an interrupt to 8 enemies and also removes a buff, so it's an interrupt / purge. Also on the minus key here we have a leap backwards 20 meter on a 30-second cooldown, and there's also functions as a break free, which is pretty nice. And then of course on equals key we have the standard break free as usual. But that's it for the action bar, guys. Now we talked about that, let's go ahead and talk about K-alerts. There are quite a few of K-alerts that I use for this build. As you can see, most of them are tracking cooldowns and such. So we'll start over here on the left. Right here, this is going to be your Torrential Rain cooldown, which is this guy right here. It's just a damage over time ability. You want to make sure that you keep this guy up because it does do a substantial amount of damage. Moving on down here, we have 2 different Icy Shards. We have one that tells you the timer on Icy Shards, so how long you have till it's gone, and then one that says, hey, Icy Shards isn't on your target, make sure you cast it. So that'll kind of help you track that. Moving on down here, this isn't a K-alert, but this is going to be how you track your turmoil stacks. This guy is usually, I think, default in the UI, like down here somewhere. I usually make mine bigger so I can see it more. And I put it right underneath here. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. You can put it wherever you're comfortable. However, I like having it close to my Icy Shards and stuff. Moving over to the right here, we have the Storm Rage buff. This guy right here is just going to tell you how many stacks of Storm Rage you have left. You have 5 total when you cast the ability. And again, you want to be using your hard hitters with that because it increases the damage by 30% and gives it a 40% crit chance as well. Moving on down, same thing. Storm Rage here, it's just labeled 30 seconds because you'll be using this guy every 30 seconds. And then this is right here is going to tell you when you have 10 seconds left before you can cast it. So you won't see this K alert until it's about 10 seconds before it's off cooldown. That's when it'll pop up and let you know. And you'll get to see that in the rotation section. Of course, over here we have Rippling Ether and then we have Tsunami because these are 2 skills you want to make sure you have up to be able to cast with this. Moving on down, we have the 60-second cooldown block here. This is going to be your PA buff. So that'll tell you when you have 10 seconds left before that guy is up. And then also, of course, just your Ancestral Force cooldown there. So pretty straightforward stuff, guys. Nothing too crazy there. Just a lot of stuff to kind of ease up your rotation. So that's it for the K-alerts, guys. Now that we talked about all that, we'll go ahead and talk about how to play Typhoon. The Typhoon rotation is more of a priority system because the Soul Tree passes allow you a chance to gain extra stacks of Turmoil, letting you cast more Turmoil spending abilities and making the rotation a little less static. Typhoon operates in 30-second blocks based on whether or not you're using Primal Avatar. If you are going to use it, you'll want to dump all your Turmoil stacks and use all Turmoil abilities because Primal Avatar Griffon will reset their cooldowns and apply 25 stacks of Turmoil to you. If you're not going to use it, you'll want to make sure that you use maybe 1, possibly 2 Turmoil spenders in that build-up block. Because if you use more than that, you won't have the 25 stacks of Turmoil when it comes time to use the Storm Rage block again. This will all make a lot more sense when you see the rotation, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. Starting off, we're going to make sure we have the middlemost creature selected. We're going to make sure that we have Font of Frenzy cast on ourselves, and we do. Then we're going to go ahead and fire off a Torrential Rain, Low Stability, Cooldowns, and Rippling Ether, Tsunami, Hurricane, Cloudburst, Ancestral Force. Once this is done, we're going to go back to our 1 key, so we're going to use Low Stability, Wind Shear, Divergence, Wind Shear, Divergence, kind of back and forth here. We're going to refresh our Torrential Rain and Icy. And we're going to go ahead and sneak a Spender in, Wind Shear, Divergence, Wind Shear, Divergence. And we want to be at 25 stacks by the time this Storm Rage buff comes off. So we're on track to do that, I think. Yeah, we're going to be at 25. We're close. We're going to go ahead and refresh Torrential Rain, and then bam, back into your Q key. Mash your Q key 5-6 times until you see Hail Volley go. Now we're into Hail Volley. Still up over 3. Low stability, Wind Shear, Divergence, Wind Shear, Divergence. Now we're going to try and bust all these stacks here. We want to try and use as many of them as we can. Oops, got to do your Icy Shard. Before this happens, so we're going to go ahead and blow through a bunch of spenders before the Griffon comes off of cooldown. So low stability, we should have used Wind Shear there, but that's okay. Now we're going to make sure all this stuff's off cooldown, and then refresh our Torrential Rain, and then bam, Q. A bunch of times till you see Ancestral fly. And this should be Ancestral. And this should put us up pretty far into the 290s. And that's pretty much it, guys. Those are the 2 different blocks you'll be working with. As you saw, the first block, after you use your Primal Avatar Griffon, you're going to be waiting for your Storm Rage to come back off of cooldown. Coming up to that block, you want to make sure that you use 1, maybe 2 spenders, because you want to make sure that this guy right here says 25 when this guy comes off of cooldown. So at this time right here, after it takes 0, you want to make sure this says 25 so you can use all 4 of these skills. For the next block, after you use that one, your Primal Avatar will be coming off of cooldown. And once you see this guy come up, you're going to say, oh crap, I'm going to get all my stuff reset, all my cooldowns reset, and I'm also going to get 25 stacks of Turmoil. So I'm going to go ahead and blow through as many of these Turmoil spenders as I can before I cast that buff, just because it's basically free damage at that point. So I hope that makes sense, guys. Now we'll go ahead and talk about the single target a little bit. So the single target with Typhoon is pretty simple. It's pretty much the exact same thing. There's just a couple different notes. The first is that your Wind Shear and your Hail Volley both do double damage when you're targeting things that are 3 or less. So if you have 3 or less targets, these do double damage. Now they're still not extremely strong, but that makes them a higher priority than, say, your single target ability here, Raging Waters. Now where Raging Waters actually comes in and actually becomes the higher priority builder is when your your enemy is sub 30% health. So I don't recommend using this build at all for single target, and that's simply because the single target is pretty abysmal. But if you happen to get stuck in this build and you know you're not going to need any AoE coming up, you can go ahead and blow through all your cooldowns and stuff and still do decently respectable single target, at least briefly. But it's going to quickly falter because this build is definitely not set up for competitive single target damage. That's pretty much it, guys. Single target's more or less the same rotation. If you want to prioritize Hail Volley and Wind Shear and a couple other things, you can do that, but literally it's not a huge difference and generally not a big deal. However, you can do that if you want. But that's pretty much it, guys. If you have any questions, as always, please leave a comment. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.